Okay, guys, this week is week 4. We're looking at the arts and crafts movement, Art Nouveau, and the beginnings of Expressionism. This is a shorter lecture this week, which is great, because don't forget you have your major assignment number 1 that is due by class time next week, so make sure to complete that as well as watching this lecture. So, what is happening historically? We are getting closer and closer to the turn of the century. We have Sigmund Freud publishing The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900, behavior often motivated by powerful forces below our level of awareness. You have the human unconscious, has a strong urge for love and power that we cannot act upon because chaos in society would erupt. Sigmund Freud is really going to be important to surrealism and this change to surrealism historically, and what surrealists are interested in exploring and looking at in their art. You also have Pavlov in the 1900s, dogs and this classical conditioning, right? The ringing of the bell and the dog's drool, conditioning them to drool at the sound of the bell because they associate the bell with food. We also have optimism for new inventions like automobiles, cinemas, and airplanes. We're moving closer and closer to World War I, but that won't happen until 1914, so we're still before that time period historically. In art, we have sort of the modernist urge to question and overthrow tradition was fertilized and encouraged by the constant change in surrounding society. Artists are going to start looking at traditional forms of techniques by looking to design, craftsmanship, scale, and function. They feel like this didn't exist in modernism. And we're going to see how sort of the arts and crafts movement versus Art Nouveau sort of interpret these two things differently. But artists are going to think about how they feel in the machine age and what that means for sort of craftsmanship and art in general. We're going to start moving pretty quickly through artistic movements, if you haven't sort of noticed this already. So we're going to look at, I think, like a total of 3 or 4 today, and then we're going to really get into Fauvism and Expressionism, and they all have different sections as well. So try to keep up and get a general idea of sort of each artistic period. The first one we're looking at is the arts and crafts movement, and this is the reconciliation of two ideas, art for art's sake and the necessity for a social role for art characteristic of the arts and crafts movement. So what they saw so much was that they didn't like the way that objects were being created, and so they're going to rethink about craftsmanship. So draws equally from the inward-turning fantastical experiments of symbolism, the exotic forms and decorative exuberance of Japonisme, and we're going to talk about that, and the innovative experiments with industrial materials undertaken by others. So artists are not only creating sculpture, architecture, painting, but also graphic design, illustrations, furniture, jewelry, and clothing. So what they saw, in effect, was that with the start of machinery and factories and the production of materials in the factory line, we have the overproduction of products that were considered cheap by the arts and crafts movement and not really having a great quality or inherent beauty. And so you have some different artists and craftsmen who are going to go in and try to change the way that products are being produced. So John Ruskin is a big example of this. He believed that the tremendous expansion of machine production during the 19th century resulted in mass consumption for new, more cheaply manufactured products. And also William Morris, who's going to develop Morris & Co., who's a friend of Ruskin, who said machines were destroying the values of individual craftsmanship on which a high level of past artistic achievement had rested. So with these sort of developments of different companies like Morris & Co., they're going to try to make craftsmanship more important versus like consumption and mass production. So this is an example of Morris & Co. They produce a lot of furniture, but we're going to talk about William Morris and sort of what he developed because he's a very interesting figure. He developed so many different types of crafts. So he sort of dips his toe in all these different artistic mediums, and you sort of get enveloped in all that he does. Like, for example, you have him producing a rug. Really, all of his works are intensely detailed, decorative, probably like highly expensive. These would be for people who could afford such decorative designs. He also produced like illuminated manuscripts for books. This is The Wood Beyond the World, published by Kelmscott Press. His company is also really not well known for producing the first reclining chair, which is the Morris chair. It dates back to 1865, and you have a lot of companies coming in and copying this chair. So a very important chair in furniture design. Where I really find myself getting enveloped in William Morris's work is in his sort of handmade and hand-designed wallpapers. He produced over 50 wallpaper designs, and he was really interested in the close observation in nature and plant forms, and then taking this and creating it into a wallpaper that could be used in a home. So while people were not, what he found was that he was not really well known for this, and people didn't buy a lot of it. Like the bourgeoisie society really didn't want to purchase it. It was more artists and people he knew that he really gained success for making these works. But I think they're intensely gorgeous. I mean, when you start to Google or look up William Morris wallpapers, I mean, they're just intense. Like the one on the right is one of his early ones, but they're so gorgeous. You can't really imagine a whole room being produced in them, but they're so intricately detailed and patterned. And some of them could take up to 4 weeks using 30 different blocks of 15 separate colors. So you can imagine the length at which William Morris not only went to design works like this, but then to produce them at large. I mean, they're just incredible. So this is really sort of moving back into craftsmanship, the importance of having products that are produced for individuals, even though he didn't gain great success for this. I am going to post a video on Canvas on how these wallpapers are made, because they're still being produced, and how sort of painstakingly, how much time it takes, to produce these wallpapers, and having to go through each particular color and each particular pattern and produce these gorgeous wallpapers. William Morris also has a home called the Red House, built by Philip Webb, which is a big part of the arts and crafts movement, where they work collaboratively to create this sort of piece of craftsmanship and Gothic imagery, desiring to sort of make this kind of artistic community that could be housed in this sort of gorgeous house. So the book mentions this, and I wanted to bring up this sort of red house that Philip Webb produced. Aestheticism kind of worked in the same vein as the arts and crafts movement, but we had the production of art being purely for art and for art's sake. So art should not be expected to serve any social purpose. It can just be for aesthetic values and interests. So you can see in producing crafts and objects that they don't necessarily hold sort of deep meanings, right? You don't have to think too hard about what a chair or wallpaper means. Aestheticism is sort of very much based in this arts and crafts movement, where you're just producing art for the beauty of art. So Frederick Leighton believed in this. This is the Bath of Psyche from 1890, in which you're supposed to just look at this classical figure, right, staring into herself in the water and thinking about this sort of dream quality of her body and nudity and etc. Another work that's sort of considered part of aestheticism is Aubrey Beardsley and his The Climax, or Salome with the Head of John the Baptist. Here we have a work, a line block print that he produced at the age of 21, and it was based on Oscar Wilde's 1894 play Salome. Salome was the daughter of Herod II and Herodias, and the stepdaughter of Herod Antipas, and she demands the head of John the Baptist, who's spreading the word of Christ, and they're very much so against that, and so she does receive John the Baptist's head on a platter. And you often see this in classical paintings, but not really in this manner, where you have this sort of romantic versus evil, and you have Salome kissing the severed head of John the Baptist, which is very sort of gross. And you have this really strange dripping of the severed head that kind of nourishes this phallic lily here at the bottom, which kind of symbolizes purity. So he created this very sort of erotic and symbolic print in which you have this sort of evil Salome figure coming in to kiss John the Baptist, and she looks like she has this billowing hair that looks like snake tendrils, and this sort of erotic symbolism of her kissing a severed head for whatever reason. So Beardsley talked about how he satirized Victorian values regarding sex and men's fear of female superiority, and sort of produced these woodblock prints, or these line block prints, excuse me, to talk about this sort of sexualization. Now, in some capacity, he obviously does fit into aestheticism, as the book says, but his work very much so has an intention of making a social commentary on Victorian values of sexuality and fear. And so aestheticism is sort of hard. It sort of teeters on moving into sort of general art history, where we talk about interpretations versus like craftsmanship and craft products. The final work of aestheticism, specifically British aestheticism, that we're going to talk about is James McNeill Whistler. We have talked about him before with a lot of his works, with Whistler's Mother and other oil paintings. Here we have the creation of the Peacock Room. He worked with Thomas Jekyll for a shipping magnate, Frederick Richards Leyland, to showcase his porcelain collection. So they used japonisme again to create this eclectic style. So when we talk about japonisme, we mean this French term coined in the late 19th century to describe a craze for Japanese art and design in the West. So you have this way that Whistler produces this room that has this very sort of Japanese and quote-unquote Oriental feel. Even have this production of a princess from the land of porcelain that's displayed, this painting that Whistler made, very much looking at the inspiration of Japan and Japanese products. We looked at this with Impressionism and Post-Impressionism as well. But he creates this really intensely gorgeous room, and Leyland, who refused to pay Whistler for a great deal of his work on the room that he had never really desired or commissioned, did in fact ban the artist from his house after he invited the public and press to view his creations without Leyland's permission. So even though it was this really intensely gorgeous work that was produced and had this very sort of Japanese feel, it really wasn't what Leyland wanted. Luckily, it was kept intact, and so the room can still be seen as a whole. But this really sort of gorgeous room was at this moment of controversy between the patron and the artist. And what's also interesting is that he produced this image of these two peacocks, Whistler did, that are supposed to represent the artist and the patron and their sort of butting heads. But you have this really gorgeous creation and craftsmanship of this room to display these objects, kind of like a production of this gorgeous museum room to house these objects. Another section outside of the arts and crafts movement is Art Nouveau, which is called New Art and based in decorative arts. It was launched in the early 1890s to 1910, and it permeated through a lot of aspects of European art, architecture, and design. It largely rejected the values of modern industrial society and sought new aesthetic forms that would retain a pre-industrial sense of beauty while also appearing fresh and innovative. But unlike the arts and crafts movement, they use machines and new materials to their advantage. So instead of writing off machines and new inventions, they very much use them to their advantage in the production of their works. So you'll see that in their use of ironwork and being able to use sort of modern technology in their production. They get their name from a gallery called L'Art Nouveau, Maison de l'Art Nouveau by Siegfried Bing, and this is really where Art Nouveau gets its name, from this gallery. And there's quite a few characteristics of Art Nouveau, although all designers can't really be grouped together in Art Nouveau. They have some common characteristics. So they drew an inspiration from nature, like vines, snakes, flowers, winged insects, whose delicate and sinuous forms were the basis for their graceful and attention to linear designs. You have the harmonizing of all aspects of design into a beautiful whole as found in nature, so a lot of focus on nature. You have the breakdown of traditional distinction between fine arts, painting and sculpture, and applied arts. We talked about this. Interior design, graphic arts, furniture, glass art, textiles, ceramics, jewelry, metalwork, etc. We often call this a Gesamtkunstwerk, which is a total work of art. So something like Whistler's Peacock Room, where you have the combination of the objects and the wall paintings and the shelves, all come together to produce this one greater work of art. Art Nouveau is very much invested in this idea. You'll also see some different inspiration for Art Nouveau in things like Rococo art, linear interlace of Celtic and Saxon illustration and jewelry, Japanese printmaking. A lot of different influences, a lot of different works in art influenced Art Nouveau, and they sort of bring them all together in their work. And you'll see how artists like Van Gogh or Gauguin very much were sort of invested in some of these Art Nouveau trends of nature and whiplash lines and etc., which we're going to talk about, and hopefully you sort of see the connection there. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Henry van de Velde's Tropon from 1899. He very much followed Impressionism and Symbolism, but finally decided that easel painting was dead end and that the solution for contemporary society was to be found in the industrial arts. So he went to use sort of fashionable, highly stylized language to advertise mundane products. So for example, Tropon is an egg-based protein extract, Tropon, the most concentrated nourishment, and produced this poster to advertise for that. So the 19th century really witnessed a revolution in industrial food processing, like coffee and cocoa and meat and dairy products. And so Henry van de Velde makes this very nature-based and swirling line poster to advertise for Tropon, and really starts to sort of bring brand identities to the modern art movement. So he's really invested in that work. It's really sort of gorgeous, and you can see it in all the different products that he produced for Tropon in particular, which is really interesting and really intricate, and sort of thinking about how people make brand identities today and really invest their time in sort of graphic design as well. As we're moving to this next producer of poster making, I do want you to think about Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. He's really sort of a precursor and part of this production of posters and lithographs. So don't forget him. Don't forget that he produced posters in sort of the post-impressionist movement versus some of these artists we're going to be looking at. Alphonse Mucha is another very famous Art Nouveau Czech artist. He produced a lot of packaging and posters. He wanted to produce more works with audience and commercial advantage, and very much used the flowing lines and saturated color typical of the Art Nouveau movement. So here are some examples of his works. We've seen a couple of them, I think, up to this point. We saw like the Sarah Bernhardt one when we talked about Nadar and photography. But his work is going to become so famous that we even see it being reproduced in the 1970s psychedelic posters and with Woodstock. And so when you go and look at Alphonse Mucha's posters, you can go and see how crazy he's been reinterpreted through like psychedelic poster making. So this is an example here. I mean, they're intensely crazy and gorgeous. You can think about like sort of drug use and how you would invest in something like these sinewy nature lines to produce rock band posters. It's very interesting. Alphonse Mucha goes to make a lot of different types of posters advertising movies and events. This one originally was made for a printing company's calendar, and it housed the 12 zodiac signs, which is sort of this halo around this female figure. And she's very regal, she has elaborate jewelry, and became this very popular design that was produced as a calendar. But even as you sort of look at it, right, it's not just a calendar. It doesn't just tell you the zodiacs. It's this very sort of Art Nouveau based artistic tradition in using these flowing and sinuous lines, natural elements of the foliage, as well as the sun and the moon, etc. He goes on to produce this woman as a sculpture as well, so you can sort of see this headdress that she's wearing that's very unique. He sort of reproduces that here in this set of sculptures known as Nature, which are this erotic sort of nature figure who's very deep in witchcraft and eroticism, this kind of disheveled enchantress. And we see him make this work in a lot of different mediums and forms, and it's really just sort of this intentionally gorgeous female who doesn't hold like a lot of specific meaning, but more sort of as this enchantress and witchcraft, and her sort of closing her eyes and thinking and contemplating what she's going to do or her next action or whatever that may be. I have 3 more examples of Art Nouveau work that we're not going to talk about at length. We have Tiffany lamps becoming extremely popular at this time. You can imagine Louis Comfort Tiffany making a lot of money off of Art Nouveau design and his use of nature and natural elements, as you can especially see in these 2 particular lamps. You also have the production of jewelry. Some of the Art Nouveau jewelry is just insanely gorgeous. You have to go and look at it. Renee Lalique makes this dragonfly corsage, which you would wear on your lapel. This combination of using this female figure with the wings of a dragonfly is just so intricate and dedicated to Art Nouveau principles and ideas. Finally, there's also a Metropolitan station that's very much based in Art Nouveau style. Here, you can see it in the collection of Hector Guimard here. And so another very popular use of not only sort of typography that's very Art Nouveau, but the design as well. We see a lot of Art Nouveau moving into architecture. Victor Horta is very well known for this in his production of the Tassel House for Professor Tassel. He gets a commission to create this house for him and to sort of design some Art Nouveau works in here. Really considered the first Art Nouveau building. And he integrated the harmony of linear rhythms and creation through this work. So the part that people know usually is the most well-known piece from the Tassel House is the stairway. And when you have sort of entering into the house, you have all of these different elements that Victor Horta is going to use to make you think of natural elements, curves, different integration of using metal and all these very industrial materials, but to produce natural looking elements. So you have these lamps that look like flowers, these columns that look like leaves, and then as you move into the house, you have this intensely gorgeous staircase with the production of the walls and even the railing, all in the Art Nouveau style. Also on the ground and even in the railing and on the walls, we have the use of the whiplash or the whiplash line, which I have mentioned. It's a motif of decorative art and design with asymmetrical sinuous lines, often an ornamental S-curve and inspired by natural patterns. There are all different ways to produce a whiplash line, but they're very much part of this Art Nouveau recreation and rethinking of nature and bringing nature indoors and the production of natural forms in architecture. I wanted to show you some random other works by Victor Horta because his work is gorgeous, and you can really see some of these Art Nouveau, oh my god, how did I do that? Art Nouveau characteristics come out in this work. Oh my goodness, give me 1 second. I also like to look at all the different elements that you can see come out in Art Nouveau design. So you can see like a balcony railing here. These that look like butterfly wings or dragonfly wings, even in the use of, again, railings or stained glass windows. You can see how they carry this Art Nouveau design throughout every element of the house. Antoni Gaudí is also a really, really famous Art Nouveau architect, and he's based in Spain and produces a lot of his work in Spain. This is the Basilica de la Sagrada family, or Church of the Sagrada family, and he was influenced by romantic and symbolist concepts of the Middle Ages as the Golden Age and the symbol for rising nationalism, and so he really moves to natural forms for a spiritual basis for architecture, while still, in this example specifically, using and rethinking Gothic buildings. So while this work kind of looks like a Gothic cathedral with its spindles here, or spires that is, it's not really a Gothic building because he's using all of these natural forms. And so when he gets this commission, he starts it and he doesn't ever actually finish it. So there still is the production today of this church trying to finish it up, but it's this really crazy use of natural and biological materials. A lot of it looks like bone and a rib cage. And when these walls sort of look flat, they're actually sort of moving and undulating dynamism. It's such a crazy work to look at. If you have time, Google it, because you'll all of a sudden find yourself sort of enveloped in the way that Gaudí makes this cathedral. And then when you move inside, you even have more of this. I mean, this looks like the body of an animal. You have this fantasy and biological ornament flowing into naturalistic figuration and abstract decoration. You have crazy brightly colored mosaics. So the way that he produces this church is really not something that we've seen before. This use of biological material almost in an effort to create this sort of living body of a church, but not in sort of a grotesque and like this is blood and organs, but in this like way of looking like you're in the interior of this like old skeleton that's been built into a church. It's just so gorgeous. I feel like I said intensely gorgeous like 70 times. I'm sorry. Another work of his that the book mentions is Casa Mila, which is a UNESCO heritage site now, and he created this apartment building in Barcelona. And it has this large structure with open courts, undulating roof lines, and elaborate twisted chimney pots, who kept up this concept of Art Nouveau in his work. This work is really interesting. Again, like I said, it has these very deep courts that kind of look like cannons or deep recesses in the earth, and you can see sort of the natural form. It kind of looks like a natural, when you go into the wild and look at canyons or something like that, this sort of recess, it looks like a natural landscape, right? But this is a produced apartment building. He also had these really intense ironwork that grows over the balconies like exotic vegetation, and you'll see this at every balcony on this building, as well as the interior. You're supposed to have not only the interior, but not only the exterior, but the interior flow into the design. It makes you feel like there's sort of no end. It keeps moving from one natural element to another. It looks like it's sort of growing in a habitat. Vienna Secession is considered a section of Art Nouveau in Vienna. So it's formed by an Austrian group of artists who resigned from Vienna Künstlerhaus, believing that the way that they were studying, picking art for salons and galleries, we've talked about this before, that it was very rigid. And so they have these grouping of people who come together are going to move away from this conservatism of the Künstlerhaus and their orientation towards historicism. And they want to provide sort of this dedicated space for art in the city and Art Nouveau. And so they develop Vienna Secession. They have this forward-thinking, internationalist view of the art world, all-encompassing its embrace and integration of genres and fields, highly idealistically, freed from the dictations of entrenched values, of prevailing commercial taste, etc. We have the first president being Gustav Klimt, and we're going to talk about him a little bit here. I wanted to also show you this building. It becomes a symbol of Vienna Secession and really as a architectural manifesto for this group, meaning that it really envelops kind of what Vienna Secession wants to look at. And so here is this really gorgeous building that's sort of white and very designed in gold and white and elaborate designs. You see these like different figures on the front, the gold foliage, as well as even sort of little details like owls and other little designs all over the building. And of course, the sort of masterpiece of the building being this leafwork dome, or the golden cabbage, quote unquote, which is a symbol of succession, visible from afar, and contained these 3,000 gilded leaves created in this dome. So you're even see through here, as you can tell in this image. And they produced every one of these little leaves to create this sort of masterful dome. That's where stand of. Sand is a symbol of Vienna Secession, and gold is sort of one of their main colors, especially of Gustav Klimt, in producing works and ideas. As I said, Gustav Klimt was one of the main figures of the Vienna Secession, and he dedicated a lot of his time to the production of paintings in this style. So he was really interested in gold and the color of gold, as I previously said, with the Secession building. And what you have here is that he was interested in the gold mosaics that he saw at the interior of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, Italy, and was really inspired by this work, as well as other Vienna Secessionist artists. And so he went to look at these mosaics and the Art Nouveau movement and arts and crafts movement, and was inspired to use sort of gold leaf in the production of his works. So if you can imagine using gold leaf, if you're an artist or ever work with it, it's very thin, it's very flaky, it's a very hard material to work with, and something that he invested a lot of time in to produce sort of the image that he was looking for. This first work is The Kiss. It's probably the most well-known Gustav Klimt work. It's reproduced all the time on like lanyards and phone covers and whatever. But it's this intricate image of a couple kneeling in a grassy patch of wildflowers, and the male has sort of this very geometric robe on that he then covers the female with as she sort of stands in her floral dress. And he kisses her on the cheek. Now, I've sort of heard two different interpretations of this work. The first is that, and sort of the most well-known, I think, is a woman calmly wraps her arms around her partner's neck, eyes peacefully closed, emphasizing tranquility and intimacy of the scene. So at the very base level, we have these two individuals as a couple embracing one another and kissing each other on the cheek in sort of a loving embrace. The second interpretation, however, is not evident at first glance, is the tension between the couple's physical relationship, most noticeable in the way that the woman's head is forced uncomfortably against her shoulder. Their position is dangerously close to the edge of the precipice, further unsettles the initial impression for those willing to look further than the beautiful surface. So instead of thinking of this work as sort of a couple embrace, you think about it as sort of the forced affection of a man upon this female who's kind of close to falling off the edge of this cliff here. And it's kind of hard to tell from the way that you look at the painting. It's hard to tell if the woman is in distress, if it's actually sort of this negative view of a couple. And so you can sort of take as you will from that interpretation. Another really well-known work that came into popularity recently is the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I. And it was commissioned by the sitter's husband, Ferdinand, and he was a Jewish banker and sugar producer, and Klimt produced this portrait of her, which is extremely gorgeous. You have her in this golden dress that's patterned very much in Gustav Klimt style with gold leaf, and her standing sort of demurely against a gold background as well. Here's a detail of what Adele Bloch-Bauer looked like and how the portrait sort of imitates her image. Now, why this work gained so much recognition recently is that it appeared in the Woman in Gold film from 2015, in which you have the niece, of Adele Bloch-Bauer going to try to get this piece back. And so go ahead and watch this trailer. I'm going to post it on Canvas, which is this link here. But if you haven't seen the film, to sort of get a sense of it. But what happens is the Nazis take this work from their home. Again, as I mentioned, Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer was Jewish. And so it was stolen by the Nazis in 1941 and displayed in the Belvedere for some time. Luckily, it is returned to the family, specifically to her niece here, played by Helen Mir. And she sells it for $135 million. So it has a lot to do with reparations and bringing works back to the right owners and families of Jewish work that's been removed. And it's this really popular painting that a lot of people have seen, and it really becomes the emblem also of the removal of removal of artwork by Nazis, which we'll talk about when we get more into World War II. You can also see this necklace that Adele Bloch-Bauer wears in the painting, right here. And even this choker was known and worn by a Nazi commander who was part of the robbing of this family, and his wife, Emmy, actually wore it to lavish parties. So this is Emmy here on the right. So you can imagine this sort of invasion of privacy and the taking of belongings, and the way that this is sort of portrayed in the film, which is very important to the study and understanding of art in general. She was also the only person that Klimt painted multiple times. Here she is again. He was very inspired by her and very interested in her looks and how she appeared in his paintings. So she became a popular figure for him. Now, I'm going to mention the idea of symbolism because I feel like we kind of touch on it in post-impressionism, and it's kind of in this area of impressionism and post-impressionism. I feel like the book wants to put Edvard Munch, who we're going to look at in a second, who reduces the Scream, as a Art Nouveau artist. I just feel like he doesn't really fit into that category. I very much teach him in sort of the realm of symbolism, which is looking at non-material realms of emotion, imagination, and spirituality, and not looking at traditional iconography, psychic experience, dreamlike states. You can sort of read over this, and we're going to talk about synesthesia and how that is applied to Munch's work, and so how we sort of read the colors and the ideas more specifically. So symbolism really helps in identifying those ideas and then using them to talk then about expressionism and Fauvism, which we'll be looking at next week. Excuse me. So Edvard Munch, who's here on the left, with his wife, they were divorced, and at some point he cut the painting down the middle. Very much sort of had a tortured psyche. As the book states, his mother and sister died when he was young, and his younger brother died in 1895, which was 5 years after the death of his father. So Munch also suffered from illness himself, and so he very much portrayed sort of death and illness in his works, and sort of this horror of this sort of darkness that he kind of lived in psychologically. And so the work The Scream kind of comes as no surprise with his life and how he felt. So Munch describes The Scream, which is a very well-known painting again. One evening I was walking along a path. The city was on one side and the fjord below. I was tired and ill. I sensed a shriek passing through nature. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood. This painting really kind of talks about not only Munch's sort of personal experience with being out in public and kind of feeling alone, and this sort of shrieking of aloneness, but this kind of modern alienation and intensity of feeling that comes in this time period. So with people moving to the cities, there's a lot more feeling of people feeling like they're alienated and alone, and this is Munch's sort of interior scream into the void, right? And his fear and his loneliness sort of taking over him as he screams with this sort of skull-like face. And you see all of these different colors that he utilizes, and you have these kind of strange figures in the background, and the red blood color as well. We talked about syntheticism when we talked about Gauguin, which is like the bringing together of these three different features that we talked about. But Munch is very much invested in synthetism, but he's also known for thinking about synesthesia, which apparently I cannot say, which is the union of senses. So the visual depiction of sound and emotion. This kind of illness, quote-unquote illness, is where you might be able to taste a color or see a smell or something like that, this combination of senses. And this apparently happens to people on drugs or otherwise. But Munch was interested in this idea and being able to bring it. Munch was interested in this idea and being able to bring it together in a painting so that you would hear the scream, this moment of scream and anxiety and openness in this dark and sinuous landscape. He made a lot of preparatory drawings and images of this work before he produced sort of the last one in sort of horror and all its fame. I really like this one in lithograph in the black and white, though it doesn't express color as well. It's another one of those paintings that everyone has seen and reproduced. I think it's funny that they have one of like the Scream film, screaming, but definitely something that's well known to people, a well-known image. Ferdinand Hodler is another artist that's kind of in Art Nouveau and Symbolism, and very much sort of knew the ravages of sickness and death, like Munch as well. And he produces this work called Night, in which he's not showing a particular moment, but a combination of ideas and fears that the artist experienced in his personal life. So it shows Hodler's own fears, so similar to the Scream that shows Munch's fears, Night shows Hodler's fears. You have the central figure, who's Hodler, who awakes to find a shrouded phantom crouched above him in a self-portrait, as is the man in the upper right, while the woman in the foreground are depictions of his mistress and ex-wife. So you have all these figures from his life, from his family that he would have known, and here they are sort of sleeping peacefully, even though they're in this sort of dark and creepy landscape and all in the nude, that you have this sort of horror that he wakes up to of death sort of sitting upon him and crushing him. He sort of thinks about this stillness and this spareness and confusion and complexity about experience and fear and darkness. So it's very sort of dark and creepy painting. The final artist we're going to talk about this week is James Ensor from Symbolism and sort of Art Nouveau as well. He had a great appreciation for Peter Paul Rubens and even portrayed himself as such in works like Portrait of an Artist, Surrounded by Masks. You can see sort of, again, these ideas of alienation and modernity coming up. Here you have a man standing in a crowd of like faceless people, right? They have masks, they aren't who they are, they're hiding their identities. Very much sort of, again, about this alienation. One of his most famous works is The Entry of Christ into Brussels. He turned very much in the 1880s to the subject matter of the torment of Christ. And here we have sort of this look at this where he combines the ideas of a religious scene with sort of personal revulsion for the world and humanity in general. So he's commenting on this great celebration of middle class and the bourgeoisie, kind of like Seurat's Le Grand Jatte. But instead, he comments on how even as sort of Christ, this Christ figure who's way back here, enters into this city of Ostend, where he lived, these people don't really greet him, they're not really looking at him, and it's sort of this intense celebration where Christ's figure is kind of lost. So he's very much commenting on conceit and the artist as a persecuted martyr, like he's Christ, right? But also this sort of losing of yourself in modernism in this city. Again, with masked figures all standing around. Now, this is a pretty short presentation. Next week's is probably going to be a little bit longer on Expressionism. This is the quote at the end of the book that you can take a minute to read, really focusing on how Expressionism takes over. As progressive artists working in Scandinavia, Belgium, Germany, and Austria turned inward to explore the realms of private desire and inner struggle, a group of French artists took to the heart of Cézanne's emanation to focus on the formal character of their work, to achieve new types of visual expression through experiments with color, line, form, and space. Fantasy and reverie, while undoubtedly furnishing fuel for creative work, required a new visual language for expression. The Fauves would finally achieve formal independence of the visual arts without sacrificing the narrative ambiguity and seductive themes that had so entranced the symbolists. So this is really a parting paragraph as we move into Fauvism and Expressionism and the use of color to express emotion, which we saw in Munch as well. So we're really going to invest our time in Expressionism next week, and I will see you then.